All right, let's get started. The sooner we get started, the sooner we'll finish. Morning, everybody, or good day. My name's Kevin Isom. I'm a web developer, have been for a very long time. And I'm going to talk about taking your web development to the next step, particularly with the front end. I tend to focus nowadays on JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, and that's what this talk's going to be about. It's moving to the next level. The web development has progressed. It used to be you might write 2-3 lines of JavaScript in a web page, just enough to maybe do a little something, a little animation, maybe a little bit of form validation. That's changed. We moved on from there. We went to things like Ajax, and all of a sudden we started interacting with the DOM more, cursed browsers a lot more, making HTTP requests from the browser. And again, JavaScript, we used it more, but we didn't necessarily make use of it more. It was one of those things we begrudgingly did it. Everybody was trying to come out with, well, let's just write server-side code that'll do the JavaScript for us. But that never really came to fruition. So we're writing more and more JavaScript nowadays. We're writing single-page apps. All of you're writing, I guarantee you, who's a web developer in here first? Okay, most all of you, okay. Who probably writes more JavaScript now than they do C#? Who would identify themselves as a JavaScript developer before they would describe themselves as a C# developer? Two hands, me and him. Good man, good man. And yet you write more JavaScript, and you will probably start writing more and more JavaScript. And even if you look at something like a Windows 8 application, where if you're a web developer, you're more than likely are going to have more skills to make a HTML, JS app than you would a C# and XAML app. Do you want to write better code? That's the question you have to ask. First, JavaScript doesn't suck. You're doing it wrong. JavaScript is a blessing and a curse. There are some beautiful parts to the language, beautiful, and then there are some hideous parts to the language. That was originally created in 10 days. Who could write a language in 10 days? I wouldn't want to do it. That's the legacy that it has. There are things that you can do to really shoot yourself in the foot. There are things that you can do to shoot yourself in the foot and the next person that's going to touch your code in the foot, but there are ways to prevent it. You want to stick to the good parts of the JavaScript and avoid the bad. Now, one of the best tools for doing that is, first off, the quote from Douglas Crockford. He is a longtime JavaScript advocate. He was preaching the merits of JavaScript before anybody else. He helped usher in, I want to say, the modern era of JavaScript development. With his book, The Good Parts. It's a little thin book. It was the first technical book I ever saw, a real technical book that was about this thick. Because, well, there's only but so many good parts in JavaScript. And it was really focused on what to do right. And when you do those parts right, it's really great. So you always ask when you write, I always like to try to ask myself when I'm writing JavaScript code, what would Crockford do? First off, you've got something, nowadays in most modern browsers, who's forced to support IE 6, 7, and 8? Who only has to support IE 7 and 8 up? Okay. So you've got those older IEs are going to stay around for a while. But in modern browsers, you actually have a built-in syntax checker for you. Use strict. The string at the top of the page, and all of a sudden, you'll get errors on your page if you write JavaScript in a bad way. It won't catch everything, but it'll catch things like accidentally assigning a variable to the global scope. Who's ever done that? You forgot to put the var somewhere, and the next thing you know, you're using the same variable name, and you thought they were different, and all of a sudden something's changing somewhere, and you didn't expect it. Little things like that. It just helps with a little bit of cleanliness. I mean, when we write C# and VB, we've got a compiler that's going to check our code syntax. We don't have that in JavaScript. It's a dynamic language that you don't really get evaluated until runtime in the browser. The next thing is you want to structure your code. You don't want to have function this, function that. Just, you include one script file that's got 50 functions in it. Used to be the common practice. Now you don't want to do that so much. You can just do use modules, sensible construction of your JavaScript. There are a number of different module patterns. I'm not going to preach on any particular one, but you want to structure your code so you can separate it out and you start writing clean code. You don't throw at least I hope you don't throw everything that your app does in one giant C# file, do you? Anybody do that? I should be quiet if you do. Why do people continuously insist on doing these things in JavaScript? Do you not want the same discipline in your front-end code that you put in your back-end code? So yes, and JSLint, as I mentioned, will check your code for you. It is as close to as a compiler as you're going to get in JavaScript. There are certain things JSLint will hurt your feelings. The first time you might have written some JavaScript that you thought was great. JSLint will find a problem with it. There are certain flags you can turn on and off. I'll show you those in a minute that will help, because there's certain things that you don't need to worry about. Or there are certain things that you'll run it in a certain environment where these things are legitimate. Who has coding standards in place for your C#? Who has coding standards in place for your front-end code? 4 hands, maybe? Why? Do you not? What do the clients see? Do they ever inspect your C#? Do they ever, do they decompile your DLLs and check things out with that? No, they see the front end. Every little bit helps. And if you're writing sloppy code in the front end, you're exposing the worst part of your app, if you will, to the clients. Do you want to do that? Is that the image that you want to present? But I don't want to do it this way. I don't want to do it the way Crockford says. There's been almost a fork of JSLint called JSHint that lets you turn these things off. Now, you can write JavaScript any way you want, and there are so many different styles out there, it's not funny. Some people don't like semicolons until they bite you. Some people like to use commas to separate things out in certain places. Some people don't like to do any number of things. The language is so flexible. There are so many styles out there that let people be productive, that they feel comfortable with. However, a lot of those things that they do, if you're doing it alone and it's your code base and you're the only one maintaining it, then fine. But when the next guy behind you's got to come back and fix something, do you trust the other guy? Do you trust yourself well enough to know that what I was doing is going to make enough sense to the next guy? So you may feel like you should be using something like a JSHint, but you could very well be stabbing the next guy in the back. Now, what about CSS? Who likes to write CSS? Anyone? Anyone? I'm not even raising one man. Good man. I won't even raise my hand on that one. I mean, I'll write CSS, but it's not my favorite thing to do. What about linting your CSS? Now, CSS lint is produced, and it will give you, there are a lot of rules. Some people strongly object to as well, because all of a sudden I have someone telling me that I shouldn't be doing things that I had been doing. Who wants to hear that? Who wants to be told what to do, especially if you've been doing it a while? There are rules, there are things in Visual Studio that will help you with this. There are extensions, and I'll show you both the stuff for JSLint and CSS in a minute. The other aspect is unused rules in CSS. If you declare rules in your style sheet, and particularly on a slower browser, we won't name any names, it's going to process every rule in that style sheet, every rule. Now, suppose you have one giant CSS file. It's going to process every rule. That's a performance hit. So, when you've got unused CSS in your style sheets that you're serving up, you have to weigh the performance hit on every page, every time of the CSS rules that aren't in there versus the CSS rules that could be perhaps in a second file, be brought in just on those other pages that need it. And there are actually tools, and again, I'll show you this in the demo coming up. Talked about the rules. Parsing errors, don't use adjoining classes, empty rules, correct properties for display. Don't use too many floats. Sensible things. A lot of these are very sensible. Don't use too many web fonts. Web fonts are very pretty. They can kill performance on a page really quickly. Or, if you're using TypeKit and TypeKit goes down, it has happened and it's annoying. And the most controversial ones probably don't use IDs and selectors. Who uses IDs in their CSS? Yeah, I've done it. I still do it sometimes, but you've got to be very careful because all of a sudden that's a big cannon you're shooting right at something. And again, I said there's a lot of rules here. And I missed the demo for this JavaScript. I thought something was wrong. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, we'll go in. Well, first we'll look at, there is a Visual Studio plugin for JSLint and CSS. And what that will give you is that should, here, JSLint and CSS cop. Build errors. Thousands of warnings. Actually, I should probably exclude this in a project. I've got some min files that violate a few things. And then to prove the point with the CSS, so we've got here just errors. Let's get rid of these warnings. Yep. It will give you the JSLint validations. Let me just delete this. I don't need this folder anyway. Okay, now rebuild. Clear this out. Oh well, nothing for it. Yeah, so you've got here, and you've got JSLint errors, and it'll break your build. That's a pretty good way to know that all of a sudden you've written some bad JavaScript. This is deliberately bad JavaScript, obviously. So if you go in and just view this in the browser, you'll see as well, yes, I want to continue with the preview anyway. Bring up the JavaScript console. An uncaught reference. So again, you've all of a sudden you've got the things that you've had in your C#. You've got compiler errors because that's what the closest equivalent would be. It's a compiler error. It's things that you shouldn't have in your code. It may be valid. It may not ever give you. In all honesty, sometimes you may never ever get burned with some of these errors. There's no guarantee though. It's one of those things. It is literally a loaded gun in your app. And CSLint's very similar. Who's used Bootstrap by Twitter for any applications? Some people know about it. Yeah, let's find out what CSS Cop says about that. So it says, where is the CSS Cop at? There we go. Now it comes up as warnings, not errors. And you see there are 31 warnings in Bootstrap. Box sizing property issues. And isn't it nice to see something that comes up like that? Because, like I say, CSS for most developers isn't something that you know. It isn't something you actually use heavily day to day, but it is one of those things that's in everybody's toolbox because, well, to get something styled on the web, you use CSS. And if you've ever got curiosity and you want to see how things go, you can just go to the CSS lint website, dump in a CSS file, and just run the scan and see what it says. I do promise you though, if you start using these some of these rules in here really quickly, your CSS will improve. You will start writing. You will think more about your CSS. You'll start thinking more about the structure of how it should be, what you should do. And again, the JS lint as well. And with the JS lint one, you can turn off some of these options, or you can set some. There are tools as well. You can actually have MS build tasks with CSS lint and JS lint. So you can enforce your quality locally, but you can do it on the build server as well. So you make sure that all the other devs in your team are meeting these same requirements. My code's better now. What next? Tests. Who writes unit tests for their for their C#? Who writes unit tests for their JavaScript? 2 hands? 3 maybe? 4? Hands again. Who writes JavaScript? Most hands, and yet 4 are the ones that write tests. There are a number of different test frameworks. I've heard the excuse before, well, I don't know what to use. What do you want to use? I mean, you're asserting values. You're just asserting that a value is X. You've got your XUnit style unit test runners like UEtest and QUnit, where it's the traditional in-unit style, if that's what you use, or even the Microsoft test stuff. You have behavior-driven frameworks like Jasmine and Mocha that are very nice, that do a given when then sort of scenario. And there are other ones as well. Probably the oldest out there is JS Unit. That's kind of abandoned, and they've moved on to Jasmine, though I think the people at Google still kind of keep that going on life support. So what does that look like? You've got here, and this looks familiar, very similar to what you do in .NET. You've got you define a test case, tests, setup, tear down. You've got mocking in there. It's JavaScript, it's dynamic. It's really easy to mock. So yes, it is that simple, and you're just asserting things are equal or null or whatever else. You've got a number of assertions. You can write your own, and it's really simple. And one of the things that you start thinking about when you're writing unit tests is that you start to pull your code away from the DOM. Things don't become so tightly bound to one particular markup style, one particular thing. So you start to write that in a little bit more open way. And then again, you've got your BDD style Jasmine here. So you're describing something, and it contains, it does something, then the function that tests does your expectations. So I mean, so you start writing these tests. Now there are certain things that you can do. You can run these on the server. If you can install Node locally, most of these frameworks will run against your browser code locally via a client, just using Node. There are DOM simulators if you're requiring to use the DOM. So you can run a command line watcher, and then all of a sudden your tests run continuously, and you're getting the immediate feedback. So you want to do that, and you want to do that because what now? I mentioned earlier modules pulling apart your code. Well, all of a sudden, when you start pulling apart your code, well, did I break it? I mean, who's ever written code in any language that you didn't have tests on, that or you've not written it, or you've seen it, that you were too scared to touch because you didn't know what the heck else was going to break? Most of us, yeah, we've all seen that. And who would probably say a lot of that you still see would be in your JavaScript code? Anyone? Yeah, it's ones that you're afraid to touch because maybe somebody else wrote it, it's not tested, it's the last time somebody changed it and something horrible happened, and you found out 4 days after deployment. So you want to write your code and start pulling things out. It's really difficult to do when you start refactoring. You don't have the refactoring tools in JavaScript that you do in C#. How can you be safe? Well, that's what those tests provide. They're your the whole red-green refactor thing. Because now that you can, so you can start pulling apart, breaking out your code into more sensible patterns. And then when you start doing that, you do get your modules. You do get, the big push at the moment lately has been asynchronous module definition, the AMD pattern. There are a number of patterns out there that fit this. The big one would be require.js, and it lets you, and first off, before I go really hard onto this, who was at my talk yesterday? A good portion of you. That talk really small. So you've got here, you've got your modules, you've got your dependencies, just like you write, all your other code in all your other languages that you use. You start going, I'm using this. I need these additional dependencies in my file. I don't have the files. I don't have the dependencies in the file. So no more one big giant script file for everything. You're starting to use the software best practices you use everywhere else. You start using them in your code here. The front end requires no less discipline than the back end. So you've got here, and this is how require.js works. You've got here, you pull in your script main, in this case, so wow, yes, that does say jQuery. For people that know me, would be kind of surprised that I'm using that as a sample. Don't use jQuery. Just have to say that. And if you want to know why you shouldn't use jQuery, come talk to me after the talk. I'll be more than happy to tell you why. So you've got here, you see there's a data-main and the script source. So you pull in your required file, and then you say that. And then here, this is what a require file would look like. You've got your dependency where I'm saying I want jQuery, jQuery alpha, jQuery beta, and then once that I have a function that's taking a callback that's going to package all of those dependencies up and give them to me. And then boom, you've got your jQuery with all the other plugins that have already been put in for you. This isn't the only one on the block. There is the YUI, very similar. They've been doing this a lot longer, where you say, I've got a using statement, I want to use alpha, beta, and I got what I need, because you've got the immediate seed as well with the Y. So you can do the exact same thing. And again, it's about declaring dependencies. It's about being smart with what you do. And not bringing in page, because who loads up you've got all of your script dependencies on one page, on every page. You either munge them all into one big file or a couple of files, and they're all on one page all the time. That's okay, but when you're building a very large, complex application, as most web applications are going, that does not scale. You're going to have problems with that. Module dependencies, a module loader, whether it's Require, YUI, Dojo has one built in now. There are a few other implementations of the AMD pattern. They are the way to go. In fact, if you take nothing else, well, I want you to take two things away from this talk: modules and JSLint. Good clean code syntax and breaking your code apart, if nothing else. Okay, then great. I've got my codes, I've got it in modules. What do I want to do after that? Events. Now, I will sing the praises of events at any chance because, well, for one, they are how the web works. They're how the web browser pages work. You're clicking on things, some forms are submitting. You've got your DOM events. It's built into the DOM. You've got clicks, submits, load, things like that. Changes when it's form elements. Why not take that the next step? Why not have events for, say you want to add something into a basket. So you've got an e-commerce site, and you've got a user that clicks on something and they've done something. And then you've got this one widget here and another widget there and another widget there, all show things that change when a user's added something to the basket. Well, how would you do that? You'd have one big click handler that did this and then that. Why not just say, hey, when my basket fires the add event, the little total at the top updated. Maybe you have a separate offer that you want to have shown when something's added to the basket. Maybe something else. These other events that you'd want to trigger on a website that you would usually have to bundle up all into one, you can get it pulled out And then all of a sudden you've got these reusable bits. You've got this loosely coupled code because you aren't tying them all together. You're only saying, I want these on an event, where then this event's going to fire. So you've got very loosely coupled code. And something like that would look like you've got your item link where someone wants to add something onto the basket. You go on, actually, I'm sorry, I wrote that wrong. It should be on click. And you'd add it to your item. And then you've got these other items that you've got on the page. Say an indicator, the bonus item, like I said, you've got an event, the basket added something, do some magic. Something else, the basket added something, or the basket removed something. You don't have all this tightly coupled code together. You've got these things pulled out, and then all of a sudden you've got this code that's a lot easier to reuse. You might have one page that uses this widget one way, and then another one is something else, and you don't have to do all that hardcore wiring at once. So, and then this is just an example of how the YUI framework does it. There are other frameworks out there. You can write your own. But again, almost every implementation I've seen is very similar. You've got a namespace and then the event if it's something that's going to be on a global. Otherwise, if you were like binding directly to the basket, it would be just like basket add. And there are there are a number of things out there. I've got there's a link at the end that's got a list of all the resources that I've pulled from for this. So I'll give you that, and I'll have links on describing how you'd actually write your own custom event module if you wanted to write it yourself. There are some samples of how it is implemented in other frameworks. Does anybody use custom events? 2, 3 people? 4. It will really make a difference in how you write JavaScript and how you feel about it. Because events are very common in other languages and in other platforms. So events just make it feel better. Like I said, really loosely coupled code. MVC. It's good enough for the server. Why isn't it good enough for the browser? Well, it is. And again, there's every dog and his brother's got a MVC client out there for the browser now. Some of them are good. Some of them are bad. Some of them are, oh my God, that's a lot of code. And they're not, it's not quite MVC as you know it though. Obviously it's not the same. It's a different environment. You're going from the server to a browser. It's more like model view routes. It's very similar. They're also very similar to the model view presenter pattern. A lot of people get confused as well. I've got this one MVC app on my page. Say you're using Backbone. I've got one Backbone app. Well, can I have multiple Backbone apps on a page? Or, oh my goodness, we've got 500 pages. I'm not putting them all into one page. Well, you can. You can have multiple apps on one page. You can have every web page that you've got, that's every static HTML or whatever rendered file that you've got, can have multiple apps on the page, can be one app on a page. You don't have to have, that is a common misconception that when you start talking single page apps, you're rewriting your 500-page app into one page. Good Lord, don't do that. You're writing the functionality in a clearer way because you're defining your model data, you're defining your views, and you're controlling when those things, when they're executed and the events that are behind the scenes on that. One of the best examples, and now there is To-Do MVC, which is really a good resource for, where we go? That lists a number of stable apps, and they've also have some other ones as well. And basically, my recommendation is pick the flavor that you like best, because they're all a little bit different. You've got something like Backbone, which is probably the first big one out there. They're very much, and there's a large community around it. There's a lot of plugins for it available. But again, it's one of those things, it was made by Rails developers because it's their way or the highway or a world of hurt. That's just how it is. And that's why there is a large number of plugins for people that have had that hurt and have been trying to get around it, but it's not built in there. So you have to consider that. There's and who's done any MVVM work with like Silverlight or WPF? Anyone? There's Knockout.js, which is actually written by a guy who is now employed at Microsoft. that's kind of MVVM for the browser. Anybody use that particular framework? Yes, I'm cheating. I know a couple people have. Yeah, and that's going to be, like I said, that's following the MVVM pattern for you, the model view model. So again, the MVC is very much, it should really be to-do app because it's all about making applications. You've got something like Angular, which is from Google. They've got a lot of effort has put into that for an MVC framework. Some of these frameworks, like Ember, they'll provide data binding and things like that. You've got the YUI, which is inspired by Backbone, very lightweight and very modular. And they're all very different ones. It depends on the framework that you're using. Like obviously, if you were a Java shop, you might consider using GWT. Yeah, it depends on your requirements and your team requirements. I mean, I can't say every app. It's all the same app at the site. I'll show you the app. Yeah, it's just a to-do app, and every one they've got on GitHub. They've got the main ones, and they've got how to do it with straight up JavaScript and jQuery if you didn't want to actually have a framework. So I mean, all these things are possible. You don't need to bring in these other dependencies, but it is a matter of all of a sudden you're applying architectural design to your applications, which is something most people would have never considered in the front-end code that they've been writing. Because usually it's make a widget, make this move here, or make this do that, and all of a sudden apps are more complex now. Customers want more complex apps. You need to start using the knowledge that you've gained in all your other development, use it in the front end as well. You know, use best practice everywhere, not just on the back end. I said I've got a preference. I would probably use the YUI or perhaps the Angular. It looks quite interesting. Like I said, I've done Backbone, and that's painful if you don't do it their way. But then there's a project called Knockback, which is amusing because it is actually, they took Knockout and Backbone and combined them. So, which to me kind of feels like, damn, that sounds like that's a hairy monster you're dealing with right there. I don't know how on earth they're going to move that going forward, but if you want something MVC-ish and model view model, that might be the way to go. Now, some of the things that they do is on modern browsers, you change the URLs, and this is where a lot of it's considered. And that's the whole route, because the router in MVC tends to be takes the place of the controller in a server-based MVC. You don't actually have to have the routes in most of these apps. That just helps if you want to save page state and come back. There are other things to do about it, though. And again, you can actually take a view and a model, and you don't need the whole everything else. You can just start bringing in things. Anybody use any form of templating on the client? That's a start right there. All of a sudden the difference would be that you're probably defining your model a little bit more tightly by using something like MVC. Like I said, these links are at isom.ws/dev312-nz. Yeah, and all of the resources are there for that. It'll be the links to the to-do MVC apps, the event library stuff, the CSS lint, JS lint, and any of those things. That's my blog and my Twitter info. If you want to contact me, feel free to come and talk to me. Feel free to, who's got any questions about any of this? I mean, this has been kind of fast, a little bit quick, but you know, that's the way I do things. So any questions out there on any of these things? Oh, okay. The problem with jQuery isn't jQuery. It's the code everyone writes using jQuery. It's all of a sudden, since jQuery does two things really well. It's a DOM API and an AJAX API. So it does, but the thing is, when everybody, all of a sudden, it did help people rediscover JavaScript. But then everyone was writing very tightly coupled code to the DOM because that's what jQuery was. And it became the center of their framework when it wasn't really a framework. So everyone was writing code like jQuery, tightly bound to all the things that jQuery did, and people were creating, and if you look at almost every plugin and extension out there for jQuery, you're going to have very tightly bound to a particular DOM set. That's how the code's going to work. It's really tied to the DOM. You don't really get anything out of it outside of DOM manipulation and AJAX calls. You need more in a front-end library. You do want structure. You want custom events. You want things like to be able to manage to create the new modules out of it. You don't have any extension in there for, at least I shouldn't say that. I have to admit I'm a little jQuery-ish light at the moment. In the last 6 months, I haven't touched much of it at all. But you don't get the module dependencies. You don't get anything like that. It does one thing. It does one thing really well. Or in this case, I think it does two things. But again, the web has moved on from DOM and AJAX. And all these other things you don't get with jQuery at all. In fact, there's some things that you actually have to add in. I mean, there are forks of jQuery. People have tried splitting it out into modules, because when you bring jQuery on the page, you bring everything on the page. You bring the AJAX library. You may not even need the AJAX library. You may not even need the DOM stuff. It depends. But you've got no choice. There are efforts to try to split it out and make it more modular, but not from the core team. Don't expect it to go on the core team. I don't think the core team want it to be the core of everything that they do. Like if you look at Ember.js, actually one of the core members on jQuery team actually is a core member of the Ember team. So, and it's not written the same way. And I think the problem with jQuery is that all of a sudden you get comfortable writing this one way. And jQuery is really easy. It was almost drug-like for JavaScript. You know, it was that first hit was free, and the next thing you know, oh, it's so easy just to do this and do this. And then the next thing you know, you've written about a one jQuery statement that you went .this, .this, .that, .this, .that about 10 times. Anybody? Yeah, don't be afraid to raise your hands. I've done it. If you've done a lot of front end stuff, you've done it. That's pretty harsh. Would you want to see that in your C# code base? Fluent APIs are very nice, don't get me wrong, but they do lend themselves to abuse sometimes.